John Corlett, the Public Health Tobacco Products and Nicotine Inhaling Products Bill Minister. I don't think there'll be too many people in the House who will be objecting to this bill whatsoever. And I think it's timely and it's required without a doubt. And particularly some of the measures that you are proposing to introduce in terms of interacting with under 18s, particularly in terms of those who are seeking applications to licences, and even whether or not for those that are banning the use of remote selling and trying to license selling online, which I think is very, very important. I also think the fact of having some of the measures that you're proposing in terms of penal measures, I think, are well required. And we've seen them before in the alcohol industry, and they do work if they are properly enforced. And I think that's also to be welcomed. Not having them in vending as vended products available to 18s, I think, is very important. And it has been said here a number of times about advertising restrictions. And I think, Minister, I'd like to one area in the bill you've spoken about in relation to cinema advertising. But I would point out to you that there's a very large industry in America called product placement, which I'm sure you're well aware, which is where companies actually pay to put their products, they pitch to put their products into movie sets. And on certain films that you're watching at times, you're wondering, are you watching a film or are you watching an advertisement for certain products? And I'll give you one example. That I've a series that I liked very much, The Peaky Blinders, and our own Cillian Murphy plays the lead role in that. But I'd say the amount of time that Cillian doesn't have a cigarette in his mouth is about 10% of his acting time in that. And that's a big problem. And it suggests to me a question as to how are we going to get that message out, because that's a lot of the informal advertising that's going on that's targeting underage. And the other thing I think which is welcome in the bill is highlighting the issues of electronic cigarettes, not just tobacco products. And I think Deputy Farrell outlined it already. There was a seismic shift in terms of the tobacco industry over the last 10, 15 years. And I think we can all remember some of the famous movies that were happening in the late 1990s regarding big tobacco, and how big tobacco was fighting back, and how there were whistleblowers in the tobacco industry were being absolutely tied up in the courts in terms of the evidence that they were giving as to how big tobacco was trying to make their products more addictive, essentially, and how they were trying to market it in different ways. And ultimately they understood that once you got a smoker hooked, as in any addiction, you created a customer for life. And that was the outline idea. That's what you're trying to achieve. It's not because you think you like to see people smoking. It's a product and you're selling it and you're making money. And a lot of companies are making a lot of money. And as Deputy Farrell outlined, we had a major change probably in the last decade where, and we saw it even here in Ireland, where a large amount of the vaping companies were suddenly acquired and consolidated by the tobacco companies. And big tobacco is no longer big tobacco only, it's now big vaping. And big vaping, as far as I'm concerned, are a completely different product to a tobacco product. In fact, I don't see that they bear much relation at all. I have a 16-year-old son, and he hangs out with 8 kids on average. There's about half split between boys and girls. There's 3 of them who are involved in GAA who do not vape, and all the others do. And when you look at them and the reason why they do it, some of the girls say they're doing it now, the same as for cigarettes, because dietary. They say it curbs their appetites. I don't know whether it does or not. But I tell you what I do know. I do know, and I have seen them coming out at night with their nails and their handbags and their vaping all colour coordinated. And it's a fashion accessory. And unfortunately, that's where big tobacco has taken it. And I know Deputy Farrell outlined also the issues of flavours. And not too dissimilar to the alcohol industry, where we allowed vodkas and cokes and all of that to be, absolutely adulterated with sugar to try and get younger people drinking it. And we see all of that in our social drinking scene now, and the same is now happening with vaping. And all of these colours and flavours, but in the large part, it's largely become a fashion accessory. And I don't know how we try to turn back the clock on that. But one other thing I would say to you, Minister, is that, in my opinion, and I spent some time doing research in the medical area, anybody who thinks that vaping, that taking small molecules of oils and other vapours into the very deepest tissues of your lungs is not going to have a negative effect on you over time is deluded. And I know that big tobacco will keep bringing out different surveys and records saying that these are a tool to get off smoking and there's no long-term damage that can be attributed to them. But I speak to a lot of doctors and they see a lot of damage already, different types of damage from vaping. And I would also say to you, there's a lot of work, particularly going on in Ireland at the moment, about trying to give drug delivery to the very smallest tissues in your lungs as one of the most effective ways to actually introduce, needed medication into your system. And what we are now doing is we're now putting vaping into those tissues. And in medicine, you want to target them for a benefit. But in big tobacco wants to target them for the addictive effect of them. And that's what's happening. So and I do support what you're doing with this bill, but I think there are other areas around this bill. I think what we have now is the normalisation of smoking and vaping, and we've got to try and find a way to get back at that. We were doing so well up to about 10 years ago. We were finally starting to, where there was a change in young people in terms of how they perceive cigarettes, and vaping has absolutely pushed that to one side. And I think it's a very sad fact, but whether you're vaping or smoking, it is the addictive nature of the product that is going to stay with you. Very, very difficult to get off, and unfortunately they are made more addictive over time. And the longer you're smoking, the harder it is, I'd say, to get off. But the health implications of tobacco for youth. And one other thing I would say to Minister, which we see, there's a lot of marijuana smoking going on in the country, as I'm sure you're aware, amongst the youth. And whether that starts with smoking tobacco products, or you smoke it because you smoke marijuana, or because you vape, or whatever, but there's a large kind of cultural synergy sometimes, I think, between those things. And we have to try and get back to the health metrics, but we have to take this out of the fashion space. There's nothing fashionable about vaping.